I think that basing decisions on your intrinsic desires rather than a desire for external validation will make people happier and lead them to make better decisions. For that reason, we're proud to stand on OG. Really quickly, what do we think this desire for external validation is? We think that a desire for external validation is when just people feel a strong need to seek approval from others for decisions that they make and for their life as a whole. This looks like things like wanting compliments on your appearance, even from people you've never met, wanting things like a socially desirable career and other socially desirable attributes, etc. I want to note that on our side of the house, people probably still have some desire for validation. They want to feel like they are important, they want to feel like they are making good choices, but they don't have this strong desire for external validation. In many ways, this means that the comparative then is an internal validation. They still want to feel themselves like they are doing the right things. They just aren't looking to other people to confirm that they're doing the right things. They're like looking to themselves to feel like they're making the right decisions. With that, two substantias from OG. Firstly, on why desire for external validation leads people to feel inadequate. Secondly, on why it leads them to make worse decisions. Firstly, why do we think that it makes them feel inadequate? We think that when people feel this strong desire for external validation, they're likely to feel inadequate because even when they are getting some of this validation, it is never going to be enough to satisfy their desires for the external validation and to make them feel confident in their self-image and self-worth. Why? I think firstly, a lot of times they're going to be getting some mix of criticism and some mix of compliments, but I think that they're just more likely to feel like the validation that they are not getting or that the criticism that they are getting outweighs. Why? I think a lot of times people internalize criticism as authentic because they don't think that someone would have an incentive to criticize them otherwise, but they take the compliments and validation that they get as people just being nice and not wanting to upset them. I think that people are just more likely to focus on the validation that they're not getting or the criticism that they are getting rather than the validation that they are getting, always feeling inadequate. I think secondly, especially from people you don't know well, they're just more likely to not validate you, more likely to want to let you down more than they want to lift you up. Why? I think that they don't want you to do things like have power than them and feel like you are more important than them, so they're just less likely to validate you and more likely to just do things to take you down. I think that on our side, like on the comparative, you're just less likely to care about these opinions at all in the first place, especially from people you don't know as well. But I think lastly is just that you're always going to be expecting to get more validation than you do. You're always going to be looking at someone else who is kind of like more, who is getting more external validation than you. You're always going to be uncertain about if your attributes are actually enough for the people around you. Like if you're actually smart enough or pretty enough or whatever, that people are actually going to give you their validation. I think that the problem is that you can never actually know what someone else is thinking or the validation that they're going to give you. There's no way of measuring this objectively and measuring if you're actually doing enough to like kind of get this validation. I think that on our side, you can measure things for yourself more objectively because you can do things like see growth in like your test scores to show yourself that you're getting smarter, etc. I think that you're just better able to feel like you're adequate. So all of this is to say that we think that when people have a strong desire for like this external validation, they're never going to feel like they're doing enough to reach that desire, even when they take actions designed to kind of like maximize the amount of external validation that they're getting. They're always going to feel like they want more validation. They're always going to feel like they are not doing enough to satisfy the people around them, not doing enough to conform to like society's image of them, make the people around them think that they're a good person, etc. We think that they're fundamentally going to feel inadequate. What's the comparative on our side? I think that on our side, you're just more able to feel secure in your decisions because they're coming from internal validation. So this looks like when you make a decision, you can justify it to yourself as to why you were making the decision. Say, I chose to go into that career because I want the money so that I can go out and buy nice things. On their side, on the comparative, when you make a decision, if you don't get enough external validation, you're always going to second guess the decisions that you made in the first place, because if you're making decisions on the basis of trying to get external validation, then if you don't feel like you're receiving an adequate amount of it, you're always going to feel bad. We also just think that it's easier to like feel this internal sense of validation than external validation because you want to feel like the decisions that you're making are good. That is, you want to internally validate your decisions. Oftentimes you're doing so in the very thought process of making a decision, so you've already essentially validated the decisions that end up making. On the comparative, you can never know for sure which decisions are going to get the maximum amount of external decisions, which is why you're always going to feel like the decisions you end up making are inadequate and you're always going to second guess them. What then are the impacts of this? We think that the inadequacy that you feel on opposite of the house just fundamentally makes you like unhappier and have a worse sense of self-worth. We think that on our side you're able to feel more confident in yourself and your decisions, whereas on their side you're always going to be feeling bad. You're always going to feel like you're not getting enough of this external validation. You're always going to have this missing desire, and so you're always going to feel bad about yourself for not conforming to these external expectations and external validation. I think this is just really bad mental harm at the point where you're just going through life feeling like you're inadequate and can never be happy enough, we think that it's a lot better on our side of the house when you can feel like you actually like have the intrinsic desire to make these decisions and you're basing your decisions based on that. Before I move on, I'll take a point from closing.
I just wanted to let you know, Claire, I think your speeches have been really good this tournament, and I just wanted to pay you that compliment.
Thanks. Cool. So moving on then to the rest of my speech, the second substantive we want to bring you from OG is to why we think that this desire for external validation just leads you to make much worse decisions. Cool. So I think that this desire for external validation, as we've already talked about, pushes you to make the decisions that you think would be the best at kind of like garnering this external validation. Make the decisions that you think the people around you want to make. What are the decisions that the people around you are going to want to make? We think that in many cases, the external validation that you're seeking is going to come from making decisions that, for example, conform to social norms or societal expectations. That is, if you're a woman, people are going to expect you to dress a certain way, and you think that the way that you can maximize this external validation, which you feel such a strong desire for, is by conforming to these social norms, by dressing that specific way. We think that in general, it just pushes you to make decisions that you otherwise wouldn't. And in general, we think that the reasons you would make decisions are better than the decisions society would make for you. That is, we think that you are a better judge of deciding things like what you should wear, what decisions you should make, and what you value than society who is placing these values on you. I want to know the one thing opposition might say is that it is good to do things that kind of like other people in your life encourage you to do because it means you do things like nice things for people you care about. But I want to know that you probably do that on either side of the house because you have some intrinsic desire to, for example, get your boyfriend a gift because he makes you happy. You have intrinsic desire to do nice things for the people you care about. We think that where external validation comes in then is primarily in the cases where it's decisions that you otherwise wouldn't make because they don't actually bring you benefit. The only reason you're making those decisions is for that external validation. The impacts of this then is that when you make decisions based on getting external validation, we think that you just do things that make your life worse. You do things like give into peer pressure and like and drink too much at a party and then end up regretting the things you did the next day. A woman's desire for male validation can do things like get her into an abusive relationship because like she cared too much about the external validation rather than what was best for her in the first place. Doing things like basing your career off of trying to get external validation means that you end up with something you're just much less happy with in the long term. This materially harms your life and makes you less happy. Very proud to stand on OG.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the leader of opposition to open up the op side of this debate. Here.
Hi. I'd like my POIs in the chat, and I have a fan going. Is there any background noise, or is it fine?
Guys, sorry. Is it okay if we pause for a second for my partner to rejoin the Zoom?
Sure.
Yep, following disconnection. You've received confirmation that they're joining again, yes?
Yes.
All right.
It'll only be a minute.
And to respond to Elo's question, there was no background noise, at least that I could hear, so that's all right.
And I'm audible and visible, right?
Correct.
All right, perfect.
We're good to start now, correct? Yes, the speaker has rejoined.
Yes, thank you so much.
Fabulous.
All right. Perfect. Let me reset my timer. All right. As I begin my speech, I'll start with some framing, go through some quick refutations, and then go into our argument. So firstly, what does external validation really mean? Well, validation, what we define it as, is what you seek from society. It's not going to be an individual person. It's not going to be a perfect model that you seek for your beauty standards, but rather you're going to go through beauty models. You're going to go to plus size models. You're going to have a society as a whole to view your validation. It's not a single individual person that's perfect. Now, what that does is it takes out most of government's first part, where they say they're inadequate because people are so perfect and you'll never live up to their expectations. Now, moving on to some more refutations, they talk about how you can become insecure because people are so judgmental of you. However, if you are always so confident, if you're always so self-validating yourself, you're going to live in an echo chamber where it doesn't fucking matter what you do because everything is always correct based on your own opinion, because you have a bar set so low because of this internal validation that it doesn't really matter what outside people say. There isn't any criticism for you to change. You live in an echo chamber where it's impossible for you to change. It's impossible for you to get better because you don't have any standards. You don't have any checks and balances to really help you grow. And now I'll get into my first argument, where it's just you help improve oneself. This is just building on the fact what I just talked about. Now, in a world where you do have external validation, you're more likely to care about others because you want their validation, because you desire their validation. What this means for you is that you're going to seek and you're going to help out others more because you care about what they think about you. You aren't going to be so much more selfish and don't give a shit about what anyone else thinks because you care about what they think about you. This is what keeps you in check. This is what keeps you in check from not doing whatever the fuck you want to do. Now, what this means is that in the comparative where you have internal validation, people are way less likely to hold themselves accountable than society. This is just a basic fact. You yourself as a human want to feel fulfilled and happy. What this means and what this implies for this debate means that you won't admit to yourself as much as society will when you make a mistake. You won't admit to yourself that, oh, I didn't do something right, but rather you're going to be like, oh, I don't really care because it's me and I can validate myself. You won't have a society that can be more judgmental, that can be more harsh, like government has said, that can keep you in check, that can help you improve, which will lead you to be a lot more better. And now, even if you do know, even if you I was just talking about where you don't acknowledge the fact that you're making a mistake, but even if you do know in the comparative that you have made a mistake, you won't own up to it. You won't take the steps to really change because there's no one else to give you validation because you have what you're seeking for. You have the end goal of validation. You have already what you really, really want. Now, what this can mean is that you're going to not really improve as much as you would in a world where external validation exists. You wouldn't improve as much as a world where there's society to keep you in check. And society, as we said, is a group. It's not an individual. And what this means is that there are people who keep you in check. Let's visualize that. Let's think about what this really looks like. Well, you can say that the margin of people that are going to be happier in this world, the people that are going to be happier when they can self-validate versus when you hold yourself accountable and accurately and improve. Would you rather live in a world that you can improve a lot more versus a world where you're just happy for doing fuck all? Well, obviously, you want to be better. You want to be a better human, and that can progress society. What this means is that society as a whole will be better because of more people doing better, improving their skills, and having criticism to really improve on that. This implies for the impact is just means that society as a whole will garnish into a better society in general because there's more people that are skilled, there are more people that can really do their jobs properly versus a world where you just live on your own, do whatever the hell you want to do because you can validate yourself and don't care about what society has to say for you. Now, moving on to my second argument, it's just about the fact that you care for others more. It can really improve the society as a whole and society and cohesion within society. How does manifest is the fact that you care for others because that you seek for validation, like I talked about earlier. Now, what's the comparative? Well, the comparative is where you're selfish, where you don't care about others because you don't care about what they think about you, because you don't need their validation, because you have your own process of validation. This is the comparative, and what this manifests into is the fact that there's capitalism, there's a rise of selfishness. Now, what is it like in a world where you rise of selfishness? Well, you don't care about your friends as much because you can validate yourself. You don't need them for validation, but rather you only care about them and see them as objects. What this manifests into is a world where when your friends ask for your help and your support, you don't really care what you do and what you say to them, and it's more likely that you lie about them and what you think about them. When someone asks you if they look bad in a dress or look bad in a shirt, you're not going to care about how you talk about it. You're just going to say your honest opinion. This can further actually create detriment to people's mental health. Now, what this means is that it will cause more selfish people and harm the mental health a lot more. This just implies that there will be so much more selfish in the comparative world just because of this internal validation, just because you don't care about other people and you only care about yourself, which means that you will do whatever you want. It'll create such a more competitive world, which means that you don't give a shit what the other person does because all you care about is the internal validation that you have. Now, like I said, you're going to not care about charity as much because you don't need the validation of others. You aren't going to care about your community as much, and you aren't going to work as a community together because you don't care about external validation and you only care about internal validation. I'll take a POI from CG.
Yeah, when I help my friend out, it's because I really like them and care about them, not because I want the validation of them saying, hey, you love me, and I'm really happy that they think that I love them.
Now, you're just talking about a margin of cases where, like, oh, you want to like them because you want to be friends with them because you like them, versus a lot of cases where you want to help someone out because you want to validate them. Maybe it's a stranger, maybe someone that you don't even know wants you to ask them help. Well, you don't really care. You don't want to donate. You don't want to give to charity. Like I said, my point still stands about the fact that you aren't going to be as good of a person and you aren't going to have as well of a society, as charitable of a society because of this internal validation. Now, onto my final argument is just kind of twisting what government said into the fact that you're going to actually be happier in a world where you have internal validation. Now, why is this the case? Well, firstly, the fact is that when you are internally validating yourself, you aren't going to set a bar as high as society. Society itself is already very harsh, and this proves in the case where government has talked a lot about how the fact that society is so nitpicky, they don't really care. This is actually, in fact, a good fact, because the bar is so low in internal validation that whatever you do is going to make you happy. Whatever you do, like I said, is going to make you confident. And overconfidence can obviously lead to a plethora of issues, but that's not the point I'm trying to make here. The point I'm trying to make here is the fact that because of how low the bar is, like government has said, you're going to be so much more happier but at one point, this happiness becomes fake. You don't have a true check and balance. You have yourself to make you happy. And if this is the case, then why do we even live in society? Why do we go out to play a sport? Why do we even compete with each other if we can just be happy by ourselves? Now, in a world where you do have external validation, that it's going to be a higher bar to be happy. There's going to be a higher bar to be happier and get that validation, because you have to work harder. And when you do work harder and you do work harder and all that, you're going to get acknowledged for this. And when you get acknowledged for it, you're going to be much more happy, because you know that you worked as hard as you can. You worked your ass off to get to that spot because you put in the effort, you put in the time, you did all the work, and you're going to get acknowledged for it in a world where there's external validation. Because in a world where there's external validation, not everyone's going to pamper your ass, because you actually have to work for stuff in external validation, which can cause to a more competitive and better world, which is just better for society as a general, which is why we're also going to be more happier in a world where you're going to get external validation, which is why we're so proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the DPM. Here.
Sorry, is this recorded?
My understanding is that it is. I
Okay,
think
that's fine. Like, I just wanted to know. Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to chat about 3 clusters of impact: self-perception, relationships, and decision-making. I want to start with a really annoying technical note. And I know it's really annoying, but it's sadly true. At the end of the LO literally says, yes, on OG, you love yourself so much. You love yourself so much that you have less of a need to ever correct, and you feel confident on our side of the house. They say confidence is bad, and I'll engage with that in a second. I just want to note, bottom half teams are bound to this. OO agree with us that confidence is good, and that we solve the sense of not being, of inadequacy. I will weigh extensively why that matters, but I also want you to note that this concession is something CO is bound to. Let's start with LO. LO says basically 2 things, which is you help others less and you better yourself less, both departing from the premise that validation is the only available motivation. So I'm going to do the obvious response of identifying the other motivations that exist, and then I'm going to flip it. The other motivations that exist are twofold. First, from a societal perspective, if what they care about is helping others and not those around me and are proximate to me, then we think moral values that you learn when you're young still activate to a great extent. The fact that you learn that to give to others, or that empathy and that funny little feeling that you feel when someone else is suffering is something you should act on and prevent. These are things we're taught on either side, which means that when we evaluate ourselves on our own morals, we evaluate ourselves on these things we learn from such a young age and are socialized into. Moreover, empathy makes us feel bad regardless of validation. For everyone who would care about other people liking them because they care about their role in society, because they care about others, they also care about seeing someone else suffer from a much more direct perspective of not wanting them to feel pain. Secondly, when it comes to people that are close to me and to my loved ones, obviously the sense of love and wish for them to be good is also a direct emotion that transcends and doesn't require validation. I want you to feel good because of how much you gave me. I want you to feel good because your smile based on how much I love you is something that makes me happier. Note how we flip them. On our side of the house, these 2 motivations remain. On their side, these 2 motivations activate alongside the wish to validate. The problem is that the wish to validate is often orthogonal or even oppositional to the wish to want to make others feel better that I identified, which are pure. Let me give examples. If I don't talk to a kid because because no one in the class likes him, that aligns with validation but doesn't align with morals. If I tell people, if I virtue signal in the workplace and distribute flyers because I care about something, even though I know that if I'm only prioritizing what's good for me, instead of doing that, I should donate and use my money for, I don't know, fucking effective altruism instead of putting flyers all across the city. In that case, virtue signaling comes at the expense of whatever is most effective. I think in that sense, we flip them. Let's move on to discussing our own impacts and self-perception. I'm going to start by noting what we clearly say that Claire explains. We identify all populations that validate and how with all of them you care more about and get more convinced by the sense of inadequacy. We tell you that with people that don't like you, like your colleagues, there is often a power dynamic incentive to make you feel lower. People who hit on you even, or your colleagues, don't want to make you feel like you are more than them by telling you that you're incredibly competent or brilliant, because that means that in that conversation, they feel that they don't meet that criteria. And often when we speak things rather than just think them, we feel them more strongly. We feel that we're stating something that's true, which is why people want to tell you that you're not as good as them. But the second thing is we tell you even for friends this is true, because Claire explains that at the first stage of getting to know someone, there's awkwardness about over-validating them. You don't want to seem needy. You don't want to seem too engaged. You don't want to seem too in love, because that means that there might be a one-sided relationship here, and I never want to give them the sense that I'm over-involved. This means that I only start to validate them when I know them more. But the problem with that is that it feels inauthentic. It feels that I'm integrating it only in order to make someone else feel good, because I didn't do it at the beginning and it wasn't my organic reaction. Thirdly, we also tell you that these things simply often don't, even if you get 90% good feedback and 10% bad feedback, you accept the 10% disproportionately, for the simple reason that when you look at other people that are pretty or brilliant, to you it seems objective. You can't rationalize that the person that's so clearly beautiful to you might not be sure of that themselves, because to you it is objective reality. So for you, the fact that there is some doubt and that when you look at the mirror you're not sure because of your desire for the external to validate you, makes you think that you're distinct from the person that to you is obviously beautiful. What are the massive impacts that accrue from all of this? First of all, notice that this influences any form of relationship, and as part of that, the transactional contributions that OO say they want you to give as part of relationships. When I feel crippling doubt, a few things happen. First, it creates tensions, because when love is the best that it can be, I feel undeserving of it if I feel inadequate in the respects that matter to me most. This means that I genuinely do things that self-sabotage the relationship because I'm scared it's inauthentic. If I don't feel pretty, I don't deserve to be with someone that I'm so attracted to. Secondly, it often means that you go towards the people that only validate you the most, which often doesn't align with those that are the best for you. Often dishonest and manipulative people are the ones that are able to tell you the most compliments, which is how you stray away and get hurt more when you don't pick people that make you feel best. But thirdly, before I explain thirdly, bottom half.
Why do children learn to smile on the World of Government bench?
So all of the responses that both OO and CO give are incredibly external. I'm not saying that you won't get 60% positive feedback. I'm explaining why the internal responses to that feedback will be to internalize it far less than the negative feedback. The second wing I want to give him here is one of universality. Whatever opposition proves, maybe there's a harm to relationship, maybe there's a harm to help occasionally. These things, they have to prove, match the same criteria that inadequacy affects our lives in. We feel inadequacy in every realm of life. The psychological mechanisms Claire identifies affect how smart I am, how attractive I am, how much I contribute to people around me, which is why I feel bad about them in each one of those interactions and not in targeted places, like the fact that in the workplace someone might help me less. But secondly, it also means that it's less reversible. There are less ways to deal with harms if they affect my psychological psyche and not the external world. On their side, even if someone hurts me in a relationship, or even if I don't get help and I have to work harder, I can tell myself, but at least I'm pretty, but at least there's someone who loves me, but at least I'm likable. On our side, since the psychological mechanisms we identify affect every part of how you perceive your competence, you can never default to something that you feel is a guaranteed good about you, which is why coping mechanisms are much harder than the external effects that other teams might describe. Opening government.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the DLO to close up the top half. Here.
Hey, can you guys hear me? Cool. Okay, so I'm debating from a cafe. Screw you, UCLA Orcom, for not telling me in advance. But if I cut out or if it's too loud, just let me know and stop me. Cool. Starting my speech. Give me actually a second. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening government must fight the trade-off. You get more validation on their side at their very best. You feel more confident about yourself, but you care less about what others think about you. That might be, in their intuitive sense of rhetorical logic, a bad thing. We think on our side, we get closer relationships, better communities, happier and better people long term. That's the simple case they don't contest with. But firstly, on taking out the extreme impacts that opening government gives, okay, first question I want to answer is, why is external validation often easier, or at least not as hard to get as opening government posits, thus mitigating a significant portion of their case? I think one, opening government said that people don't want to give external validation, and I think this like sort of predates or like sort of the prerequisite analysis for a lot of their linkages. I think it's very likely that people do want to give. I think people want to give compliments because when you give a compliment, you're likely to get one back. I.e., if I call someone else pretty, you're likely to get something in return. So there's likely some level of external validation that does happen and is accessible. But I think secondly, you often care about the external validation not from completely random people, maybe a little bit from random people, but the vast majority of your external validation intuitively comes from the people that you care about, i.e. those who are close to you, i.e. those who you are friends with. These are people that want to care for you. Those are people who want to tell you that you're doing well. I think the implication here is it's not as hard to get some semblance of external validation as opening government says it is. I think comparatively, internal validation can often be a lot more biased and can lead to a lot like, I guess, harder ways of like feeling good about yourself. I think the implication here is that you can use Claire and opening government's mechanism against them. People like to focus on where they like did shit or like where they aren't completely winning. I think that happens internally as well, i.e. if you buy their own case that people are likely to like focus on criticisms a lot, then internally you're likely to see like, look, I set this goal, this is what was going to validate me, I didn't meet it, so this is why I'm sad. That is then to say, comparatively in our side of the world, we create some external perspective that at least allows you to feel somewhat good about yourself. The implication here is that you feel at least somewhat good about yourself on our side of the world, while on their side of the world, you probably like aren't as easy to feel good about themselves. But I think the overall implication here is that opening government's case just doesn't access the extreme arguments that they think it does. I think it's very likely that's a heavily mitigated version of their case. But we're going to bite the trade-off. Opening government is mitigated, but you probably feel a little less happy on their side, because it's very likely that you're going to care a little more happy on their side, because it's very likely that you're not going to be as affected by criticism, that you're not going to be affected by external stuff, that you're going to be able to set easier standards. Why is all of this a bad thing? I think one, you just hold yourself way more accountable on our side of the world. Why is this the case? When someone calls you out on their side of the world, that is not your sense of validation, so it's less likely that you're going to care about it. This is something opening government cannot symmetricize. It is very likely that on our side of the world, when you base your validation on what those around you are thinking, if someone is likely going to criticize you or someone you care about is likely going to criticize you, you're likely going to take that way more into account than you would on their side of the world. The question I want to answer here is, why is criticism going to manifest in actively good ways that make people actively better? I think one main thing here, tracking the same mechanism I gave earlier, that you care about people who care about you. The people who care about you are likely going to give you criticisms, not in a punitive way, but practically in a way that are going to make you feel better. When you're internally validating, you often like Jay explained to you the mechanisms here, but it's very basically that like you're often going to be biased towards yourself. You often don't want to hold yourself accountable because you're biased, like even seeing where you fucked up on. And secondly, it feels bad to hold yourself accountable. External perspectives want to hold you accountable, and they want to hold you accountable in a good way. So that's one unique impact that we get. But I think secondly, you do help others. And I think this is going to be a big clash, and opening government tries to like symmetrize this and say that you care about others in both worlds. But there are massive structural reasons to be selfish, sans external validation, that forces you to care about people. I think Jay gave you these reasons that weren't responded to. Things like individualism and capitalism that push you to just acquire more and more and more, that permeate every single aspect of your everyday life. That is to say, from when you are born, you are told to get as much as possible, to get the best job, to make as much money, etc. That is something that does not go away. And that is how you're going to base your internal validation, because that is your broader societal socialization. But I think secondly, evolution probably makes you grow up in a way like structurally over long periods of time to just want to get more for yourself because it's survival of the fittest. We think external validation is the balancing factor. When you're trying to seek other people trying to make you feel good, you're not just going to do what's selfish for you, but you're going to do what's best for others, because that's how you're going to get people to give you that validation that you so yearn. I think good people will likely care about others in both sides of the world, but bad people, people who are selfish, are those who we uniquely access doing things for people. That's where the actual delta is bad people who would be doing bad things for others, who wouldn't be helping others, we're accessing them helping others. I think opening government says like empathy is very unclear why people are empathetic, i.e. you might be taught to be empathetic like in your kindergarten class. It's unclear why that trumps things like literally like individualism or capitalism being pushed on you from a very young age. And secondly, it's very unclear that empathy trumps your own self-interest, as your self-interest is going to be based on your internal validation. If your internal validation is not going to be as easily gotten from others as they say themselves, it's unclear why you're going to seek it from others or seek caring about others. External validation is how you get that caring for others. The impacts are really fucking massive and win this debate. I think one, you just get better people who are more willing to hold themselves accountable, look at where they're messing up, not only look for their own validation, but actually take criticism into account. This means people feel better about themselves in the long term because they're improving, they're becoming better people. But I think secondly, you just get more community building. I think people are more willing to do things to adapt to other people. Before I move on, I'll take something from closing government, I believe.
This entire argument assumes that you only get validation from doing good things that help others. Do you care to prove why you don't get similar amounts of validation in many cases by doing bad things to others, e.g. validation in school from bullying someone?
I think it's very likely that the amount of validation that you're going to get from helping someone is going to like often be a lot better, a lot more meaningful to you if you help them versus like bullying someone is very unlikely to manifest in like broad scale, like positive things. You're likely going to get a lot of pushback to that. It's much safer to do things that are positive. And bullying probably exists in both sides of the world, and it's probably like manifested more if you're just going based on individual pushes that aren't really regulated by what others care about. Okay, I think why do you get more community building is because people are more willing to listen to criticism. I think this is independent of the helping others argument. It's just you're more willing to listen to how you validate other people, and how you validate other people is how you adapt to them. Things you have to change, i.e. if I was too selfish in my relationship, I would hear like what the other person has to say, and I'm more willing to adapt to that versus internal validation is likely not going to derive that. And I think thirdly, you just get more charity, more random help on our side of the world. I don't think billionaires give to charity because they actually care about the causes. I think billionaires give to charities because they like how it looks to give to charities. I think that's actually a good thing, and that's one of the most real impacts that we have. That's probably tens of thousands of people that we uniquely save and get help for on our side of the world because it looks good to help others. I think the impact is very, very simple. You make people better, which co-ops long-term confidence, thus co-opting OG, and relationships are the most important thing because that's how you access long-term happiness. Confidence always wears off. How you access happiness is through relationships, which adds texture to your life, which adds support, helps you in your most vulnerable moments.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I call upon the member of government to open up the bottom half of this debate. Hear, hear.
I'll take POIs in chat, please. The cravings for social validation alienates you from yourself. I want to begin by explaining why this narrative is one that is overwhelmingly coercive. One, I want to begin by explaining why this narrative manifests in poor and coercive ways. And the critical mechanism here is that this narrative is often enforced through shame, because the shame is a strong signal that people have incentives to utilize against people who do not conform, because it signals that you are conforming, that you are part of the in-group, that you are doing things that are deserving of social validation. This creates a collective action problem and a race to the bottom where people compete to say things like, to shame people harder, to signal harder that they are the ones that are actually standing up for the in-group and doing things that are of common interest and doing things that are socially accepted, and to signal this in this way. It also means there's a collective action problem where other people do not want to stand up for people who are being shamed in the first place because they fear that they themselves are going to be shamed. What is the importance of this analysis and how this is actually enforced? This is critical because not only does it show that this is an overwhelming desire, or why social validation creates an overwhelming force that forces people to conform in the first place, it proves that people are actually unhappy when they do not conform to societal standards or what is socially desirable in a community, and as opposed to, for example, the omission of a benefit in of itself, we prove active suffering through this omission. But secondly, I'd suggest that people often this creates dependencies on social validation that are operate in inherently unhealthy ways, because perhaps you're unhappy with your own life, irrespective of your social like the degree of social validation you're getting. Maybe you failed your job interview that you wanted, you failed to study for a test that was meaningful to you because studying was hard and you weren't happy with this. But the problem is that in the immediate suffering that you experience, you want to take the easy way out, where you do things like you retreat into avenues of accessing social validation. You go to parties to feel hot, to feel wanted, and this means like while the rest of your life spirals, and which causes the problems to get worse in the first that the problems that cause you to be unhappy in the first place to get worse. But critically, these are things that actually matter to you, which means you're experiencing more harm, even if you're accessing this validation, because the things that do not provide you superficial validation, but rather actually are important to your life and your values, actually get washed away. But furthermore, maybe you're like insecure with yourself as well. Like I know OG says internal validation is easier. Maybe this is true, but presumably there's still some people that struggle with personal internal insecurities, irrespective of what society thinks. Like you're just worried about whether or not you're going to be able to fulfill your dreams. But the problem here then is that if social validation exists, this is the easy way out again. That means you're never forced to work on yourself and self-reflect and develop this internal confidence. And the problem here then is that social validation is fickle and not always there. So it's worse if you develop this dependency. And we would prefer a world where you're forced to confront yourself and develop the internal validation that OG thinks is so important without the easy way out. The implication of this, and the reason why this is important, is because in theory, you can still have some degree of internal validation and opposition. This isn't a binary, where we are defending a world with no social validation, but they do not necessarily have to defend no internal validation. But we uniquely prove why this is an overwhelming narrative or an overwhelming desire, which unlocks a lot of open government. Secondly, I want to break the quote-unquote deadlock as to why societal pressure is bad in the first place. So I think OO says societal pressure incentivizes you to do good things. OG gives reasons why you might have incentives otherwise to do those good things, but not why overwhelmingly the way social pressure is applied leads to bad actions. A couple of reasons. Firstly, among adolescents that are the most prone to desiring social validation because their brains are still developing, often doing things like rebelling against like things that are seen to be good for you is often seen as desirable. To do things like drink and smoke, because oftentimes this is a signal that often makes you seem more cool in the first place. And notably, adolescents communities are other adolescents, and this is your society and where you get social validation in the first place, which causes you to do self-destructive things. But secondly, a self-destructive behavior is a costly signal that shows you're willing to go far to join to join certain social groups and demonstrates loyalty towards an in-group, which means that you have incentives to want to prescribe these as things that are socially desirable and valuable in the first place, which means that it leads to self-destructive behavior. And yes, comparatively, there are other reasons to want to do things that are good. For example, moral norms that are not contingent on social validation, but rather what you believe is right or wrong. You still have incentives to instill good actions as things that are morally desirable, even if not societally so. And obviously, other incentives like health would still apply to not do things like smoke. Pragmatism, like not wanting to make enemies of other people that are just like bad for your future and future connections, but also things like, laws that probably enshrine things that are socially utile. But we uniquely provide the analysis as to why things that are prescribed by social validation are uniquely harmful. Thirdly, let's talk a little bit then about a main extension about why this leads to better friendship formation. And the premise of this argument here is that the desire for social validation means you often act inauthentic. You're afraid of saying things for fear of being seen as awkward, even if this reflects your genuine personality. You're afraid to talk about hobbies and passions and your interests because you're afraid of people thinking they're like quote unquote cringe or things like that. So you never express things that are actually meaningful to you in the first place. And critically, this means that when you are forming friends, you're not forming friends based on the basis of what you both collectively actually value and on genuine or in authentic manners. You do not talk about things that actually make you happy, and you do not mutually care about things that would make both of you happy in the first place. This means you do shallow small talk where you talk about clothes or boys or whatever you think is socially utile or socially accepted. But the importance of this then is that this means you do not develop intimacy, because intimacy requires you to be comfortable enough with a person to open up and talk about things that might make you feel like that might make you at risk of being shamed, or even it just requires a degree of institutional genes of friendship to even feel like you're comfortable enough to talk about things that are actually important to you. You can never feel intimate in a friendship if you do not actually connect on these bases. But I would also just suggest that feeling like you can connect with a friend on things you find important is intrinsically emotionally useful in and of itself. What is the impact of this? The impact of this is that you'll lose one of the things that brings the most meaning in the world, because on OG, on the counterfactual, maybe many people are secure in themselves. I don't even know if they prove this sufficiently, but some people still will not be. This means that you have fears that you can never be great, that you can never achieve your dreams, but uniquely on our outside the house. You can vent to your friends. You can do things like problem solve together to talk about issues that you're facing in your everyday life. You can hear things like, I believe in you, which is not a form of social validation, but a sign of trust, but also a sign of confidence that someone who knows you very deeply as a person thinks you can actually achieve your dreams, which brings you confidence. You can access friends, which is incredibly important in this route. Finally, a plethora of reasons as to why you will not actually get happiness from validation and why instead you will actually suffer. First, the hedonic treadmill argument that is different from feeling like signs of affirmation are fake, but the actual claim here I'm making is that you become normalized to current standards of happiness and metrics of happiness, which means that it stops bringing you joy, which makes criticism overwhelm the amount of joy you get from positive validation, irrespective of the actual quantity of it. Secondly, you fear losing it. We have a degree of anxiety about what you already have, and this fear means that even if you feel happy, the fear outweighs it, or washes it out. But thirdly, you get a great degree of anxiety from the uncertainty in and of itself, because even if people are acting because of a desire to do what is socially a form of validation, you still want authenticity in other people, so you want the compliments they're giving you to be real, which means that even when you get compliments, there's a constant anxiety about whether or not the compliments you're getting are real in the first place. But the final comment I'm going to make then is that oftentimes it's also unsustainable, where people who really desire validation do things like impose this burden on other people, to ask them to affirm that they always love you, that they care about you, and they think you're pretty, which actually causes them to be exhausted, which maybe means they react in moments of exasperation, but you see those moments of exasperation, and then this causes you to catastrophize and internalize it, which means the desire for validation often means you're robbed of the validation that you valued so much in the first place. For all of these reasons, propose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the member of opposition. Here.
Cool. Can I just confirm that it can be heard? Yeah, sick. Cool. POI's in the chat. I'll definitely take one, so don't worry. I want every member of the panel right now to try and remember the first time that you ever looked to another person to tell whether you were doing something that was good. And I'm going to bet that you actually can't remember the first time that that ever happened, because it was probably when you were an infant. This fact of humanity, the need to obtain some form and some amount of external validation from other people, is so hardwired into our fundamental makeup as a social species. The world would be incredibly different without it. I think the rest of this debate so far has been pretty shallow. People have talked about friendship. People have talked about paying each other compliments. We're going to be a bit different. I'm going to firstly explain why human communities are far worse off under side of government and are borderline impossible to live in draconian hellscapes in an absence of the ability to socially regulate through seeking validation from other people. I'm secondly going to explain why people's intrinsic motivations are often very bad at pushing them to do what they want to do and change their circumstances. Let's firstly start with why human communities are impossible to live in. There are a couple of premises at the start of this extension. First, just the observation that this is a prefer a world debate, and that the thing that we are changing about humanity is so fundamental to our character as a species that you should contemplate as within this debate fairly dramatic changes to the way that social orders operate, beyond just whether people make slightly more selfish or slightly more altruistic decisions, or whether people are slightly more or less superficial in the way that they conduct friendships. Second, that in a decision-making like matrix that clearly does encapsulate many influences, many types of decisions, and the way that people live their lives, that it really is important that you accurately place this as taking place over a really long period of time, because that is where you get entire demographics that shift, entire populations are affected by this change in decision making. There are three cascading arguments from closing opposition under this point. First, complex human communities are very unlikely to form from the outset. When I say complex human communities, I'm talking about communities that stretch beyond just a kin group of unspecified labor, communities that are capable of agriculture, communities that are capable of specialization. Why is this likely to be the case? First, complex communities require large amounts of consultation and information when individuals make decisions, especially at the outset. And it's really difficult to know how much you need other people's opinion, or what specific types of information you need when the decisions that you make in your life affect other people so profoundly when they're very proximate to you. So wanting to know what people think about you is a great driver to consult, like literally who you marry, what type of job you do, what types of financial decisions you make, where you set up your house could dramatically affect the lives of the people around you and the overall productivity of your group. So it's important to know about them. But that is information that's often quite difficult to predict. Second, complex communities require the long-term net reduction of conflict because of the information asymmetry about what is, and the grand heterogeneity about what is likely to make people upset and how people are likely to react, requires that you preemptively consider in a fair amount of detail whether or not something you are doing or saying or a path of action that you're about to take is likely likely to upset people in order to reduce the likelihood of that conflict that does like tear small communities apart in many instances. Thirdly, the communities require the enforcement of normative behaviors that are often contrary to people's immediate desires. Like take having children, objectively kind of a utility like reducing thing to do for the individual, but communities would die without a constant influx of new population. And note just how much social regulation is barred from the government's I guess contemplation in this debate, because it's based on, like, for instance, deification of behaviors like fertility or participating in agriculture, because God is external, and the way that people encourage pro-social behaviors came from sources that were external to them. And yeah, sure, like sometimes this is not awesome for individuals. Sometimes individuals make decisions that are slightly worse for them or even moderately worse for them. But in many instances, these were necessary for the survival and prosperity of the group. And second, I think that societies are pretty good at adjusting for how much this is necessary at any given point in history, which is why post-industrial societies are far less kind of draconian about how many children people should have and when they should have them and how early in life they should have them than say pre-industrial societies. Second premise, even if complex communities do form, they are draconian hellscapes for a few reasons. The first is that non-interventionist regulation is contingent on a policing and enforcement of morality, so that you don't have to monitor people day in, day out. You set norms and expectations of politeness. You set norms and expectations of how people are to support themselves. That means that or how many children they're going to have, or whether or not they're going to obtain education or get a profession. And when you don't have the ability to do that, you end up having to resort to it in other ways. Because secondly, you don't actually when you remove the desire to please other people to a certain extent, the material needs of human communities, and government bench can't, which only they just remove the carrot, which still leaves the stick. So you get more violent intervention into the way that people live their lives, especially with regards to reproduction and productive labor. And second, you get less cope, even if the outcome was the same. Like, I'm sure lots of people did not enjoy having to have 10 children, but they would probably prefer that it was in service of some higher good, or of seeking external validation from some other source of morality or source of authority, even if the outcome was the same. So it made them feel far better about their circumstances, like they were genuinely doing something really good for their community. That makes it really difficult to govern these communities without being highly interventionist. Thirdly, even if they do form and are governed well, people are overwhelmingly less willing to accept trade-offs, which means they are far less efficient. And this, it's like, they like for the sake of, say, like duty or other reasons that people might accept a trade-off. You lose the reason that external validation is so good is because it costs the people who give it exceptionally little, but it is a currency because we give it value. And that means that people are willing to, say, go to war, or they are willing to take on professions that are really difficult to obtain because they are pro-social and good for other people. That is incredibly important. So human communities onside government over the course of history would have been unproductive, miserable hellscapes that were hard to govern and vulnerable to virtually every kind of shock. I'll take closing. Opening?
You still
Okay.
don't explain why we can't inculcate morals as we explain in OG.
Okay, but here's the thing. You guys assume that a sense of morality is innate. I don't think it is. I think that an innate sense of morality would, if we'd seen human communities that had an innate sense of morality and didn't need to appeal to any higher source, we'd have seen human history that was like a little bit less violent, destructive, and rapey than it was. So there are external sources of morality, and that is what people turn to when they actually have to make a decision between their material needs, like whether you stab the guy who has more food or whether you don't because you think you'll go to hell. That is explicitly external. Like, God is external to myself. It is external to the universe in many instances and systems of belief. All right, second argument, why people's intrinsic motivations about it pushing them to do what they want. Firstly, people's intrinsic motivations are fleeting and short-term. They're contingent on people's things like their physical constraints and their biology. They're often self-serving and kind of like a self-serving feedback loop that kind of compels people to be relatively content with the way they are, and it adjusts to whatever particular point of success in your life that people are at. Second, external validation is often paradoxically very critical because you have your own emotions cloud it and your own perception of yourself, and there's often an evolutionary, a psychological push to not be outcompeted. Makes people kind of perpetually dissatisfied, but often really unable to change any part of it because of the kind of short-term like harm to their own material conditions. And this provides a very valuable circuit breaker to break people out of it. That is the actual way that people improve themselves, not what opening opposition tells you. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the Gov Whip to close out the Gov side of this debate. Here.
Thanks so much. I'll be taking just a few seconds.
You have 30 seconds.
Lovely. Okay. Great.
That is time.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'll start by weighing us explicitly against opening government. First, some horizontal weighing. Our argument about friendship is more important on an impact level than opening government's argument about inadequacy for a number of reasons. One, it is much more comparative of an argument. Most of the harms that opening government identifies of external validation are insufficiently compared to the benefits that you get from internal validation. Here's the argument opening government makes, the exclusive argument for why internal validation works. PM says, well, you can always look to yourself, and the reason is you have an incentive to have a positive internal validation of yourself, so you constantly give yourself internal validation. But the fact that you want to have a positive sense of yourself does not automatically mean that justifies the jump to having a positive self-perception. In fact, DPM themselves provides the mechanism for why you struggle to get internal validation, which is their own claim about imposter syndrome. You're not sure when you look in the mirror if you're beautiful because you perceive someone else as objectively beautiful, and therefore you don't trust their commentary about you being beautiful. Yeah, but that's also a reason why you don't trust yourself when you call yourself beautiful while you call another person beautiful. So opening government manages to identify a range of harms of external validation, but they are insufficient in demonstrating that internal validation on your own and via introspection can solve this problem. Liz identifies that you have an option to solve this problem, which is you can determine your self-perception by consulting people you trust around you as long as you form strong friendships. The second reason friendship is a more important argument on an impact level is people's self-perception is overwhelmingly shaped by being able to run thoughts by other people. Why is this more important than opening government's mechanism of internal validation and self-perception being worse or people feeling inadequate? Number one, people spend more time with friends than in introspection. Even if a person feels inadequate, it is unlikely that they're going to go through their whole life constantly thinking about the inadequacy, because lots of people all the time avoid introspection. Like, people have lives, they have jobs, they think about other people. They often, if they feel inadequate, don't think about themselves that much. So they have an easy opt-out when it comes to introspection. However, people spend a bunch of times with their friends. Consequently, a lot of the times when they introspect are times when they talk to friends about themselves, and that is a moment when you need a genuinely authentic friend whom you can turn to and tell about your struggles, as well as a friend who is a good match for you. But second, trust in others. Independent of validation, people don't trust their self-perception of themselves. People are aware of all the problems Amitai describes of self-perception. Friendship offers a way to form a strong self-perception that is dependent on trusting someone else. Note, however, our arguments apply under DPM's weighing, because DPM's weighing is this is irreversible, and this is more important than external things because at least you have internal validation. But our whole point is your self-perception is changed by the friends whom you choose. Consequently, our mechanisms are really important. We explain, one, that you do not develop intimacy with friends anymore, and second, that connections with friends are much worse because your friends are worse. OG's attempt to argue your friends are worse is there are some manipulative people who might try to become friends with you. But OG's own argument about morality shows there aren't that many manipulative people. The problem, however, is even well-intentioned people might not be compatible with you, might not be people you can actually trust, and that means the quality of communities around you goes down substantially. But second, we outweigh OG on their own metrics, because OG's arguments for inadequacy are worse than our arguments for inadequacy. There are two problems with OG. One, their individual justifications are not as strong as they could be. They have three of them. One, they say there's some mix of criticism and compliments, but you overweight criticism relative to compliments, because criticism is seen as authentic, but compliments are seen as just being nice. But the extent of their justification for this is the imposter syndrome claim, which I've pointed out is incompatible, and it directly contradicts their immediate second mechanism, that people don't overgive compliments because they don't want other people to have power over them. If that's true, then you're unlikely to overweight criticism, you're unlikely to think compliments are fake, because the compliments that do happen are compliments that are genuine. Their second mechanism is others are more likely to let you down, because letting you down makes them have a power trip, essentially. But it seems to me that to some extent, like, I don't understand why letting someone down is a power trip, should, or why complimenting someone makes you feel inadequate. If anything, they are happy. Like, I don't actually understand the extent of this mechanism. I think it is insufficiently analyzed. Their final claim is you are always going to be uncertain if your attributes are enough to get someone's access to self-validation. But that is also a logical leap. You can't read others' minds, but that doesn't mean you don't know what's going to give you validation. So OG has justifications, but they don't meet the burdens underlying the justifications. Our mechanisms are stronger. What are the mechanisms we give you for why you are internally worse off and feel more inadequate? One, a hedonic treadmill, that no amount of validation is sufficient to give you happiness because you get used to your current level of validation. And second, anxiety, that people are exhausted by asks for validation and react in moments of exasperation. And exasperation drives a lot of what's feeling insulted, and that in turn makes you feel insulted, makes you feel like other people hate you. But second, we give you arguments for why validation is just that important. Because even if all of OG's harms of validation are true, you can still desire other things and get happiness through other means in theory. What Liz explains is that validation crowds out everything else when you form a dependency on validation. Finally, on self-destructive behavior, OG gives some reasons why you might be peer pressured to drink. OO gives some reasons for why you might be pressured to be selfish. Liz gives you the mechanism for why social norms and peer pressure tend towards self-destructive behavior, because it is a costly signal of loyalty toward an in-group, and because it is good at enforcing social conformity. And this in turn causes you to make a lot of the bad decisions that opening government is claiming. Now let me use this extension to beat the other teams in this debate. Closing opposition first. Their argument is complex human communities are very unlikely to form from the outset. First, they say there's a great driver to consult other people to seek validation. No, you can still get first order information about someone. For example, if you're entering a relationship, you can learn about someone without wanting their validation. Their perspective is different than their validation. Second, they say you want to avoid upsetting people, but once more, that's not a need for validation. That's just if you upset them, they will be angry at you, and that leads to tangible consequences to you. For example, they might punish you in some way. They say God is external. Yeah, but God isn't validating you. You're scared of going to hell. This argument is nonsense. Finally, even if complex agricultural communities don't form, that's fine. Hunter-gatherers were arguably happier. Complex agricultural communities led to industrial factory farming that massacres bunches of animals. You have to prove that hunter-gatherer lives are bad. They don't do that. Second, they say norms are unlikely. You set norms, you don't follow norms. But there are many reasons to follow norms without validation, like caring about the survival of your community. In fact, repression and imprisonment are fine to enforce some norms, but many social norms enforced through validation throughout history were bad. It's the reason why generations of people could never come out as gay, because norms of external validation repressed their capacity to come out as gay. Finally, closing opposition's argument is literally the entirety of human civilization would not develop, but they give you zero reasons to think human civilization developing would be good, and it's an argument that needed a lot more analysis to be filled. Finally, on opening opposition's claim about echo chambers, flip this argument. You get less criticism because criticism feels like it hurts people's feelings more, and you bristle at the thought of criticism. You feel sad when you are criticized, and you don't try to improve yourself when you are criticized on their world, meaning you are less able to improve yourself. Propose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the opposition whip to close out the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Hello, can people hear me? Oh, great. Okay, for points of information, if you do a raised hand react, I will call upon you when I get a second. Caring about what others think of you on a deep and primal level is the strongest force that bound humans together the second we evolved to become humans. It is not a sense of morality or a sense of fairness that ensured you fed the person next to you when they were hungry or mended their wounds. It was a fear for being seen as an outsider. The rest of the debate sees that as coercive and bad and twisted. But we just make the observation, when people are utility optimizing freaks that don't care about what others think of them, society is worse. People are unempathetic, and people just generally live worse lives lives. Government whip was wrong to ignore us. Don't make the mistake that they made. Firstly, on closing government, secondly, on extensions. Firstly, on closing government, they have two. The first is saying this norm is coercive. That is fine. We explain why this coerces people to do good things. They say that sometimes this coercion might be used to get you to do bad things, such as drink with your friends. We'd identify that there are other people who use this norm to coerce you in good ways, such as your parents telling you to not drink with your friends. So every time there is a bad example, there is also a good example. That extension is dead. The second extension is literally the power of friendship and saying it's harder to make friends because you feel awkward. But first response, placing your activity based on what people think about you is excellent for forming friendships, because first of all, you can do things like brush aside interest when people start talking to you. If you don't find them interesting, you can talk over them if you're not interested immediately in what they have to say. You can make insulting comments because you don't care about their reaction, because you don't have that same visceral connection to the things that they care about. What this means is, in the absence of this external mechanism, caring about what they think and wanting them to think you're a good person, it is harder to make friends. But second of all, it will always be scary to make friends. It'll always start off being awkward, which is why you need those first smiles, those first compliments to give you a reward, because it'll always be scary to get over this hurdle. You need to do that and get some reward before they become a shoulder to cry on, before they become a valuable relationship you have in your life. So to the extent you think this norm exists, it is good at regulating people's behavior, and you need some incentive for people to actually move forward with their days. Firstly, on the extension then, why external validation enables the foundation of the nation state. And the first and most intuitive observation is that sometimes in societies, people need to do things that are bad for them in the short term. You need to have and raise children. You need to work harder at your job to care for your family. You need to not steal and kill the person who has more resources than you. You need to pay tax to ensure everyone in your society is well fed. We identify that this is imperative to formations of society, and this entire opposition government bench has one response, and they're like, oh, well, like, empathy does that, and I like seeing my friends smile. But first, and second of all, they say, well, there might be actual ramifications if you're mean to people. But none of these responses work. The morality in seeing your friend smile response doesn't work, because first of all, our mechanisms operate on a non-personal level. We're talking about the construction of governments and societies, and you can't see a society smile, which is why you need this innate need for social validation. But second of all, we act upon strangers often. It is whether or not you hurt a stranger to get the resources, someone opinion you don't necessarily care about, outside of this direct need for validation. But third of all, even if you believe this is a force that binds people together, you need an insanely strong force for people to overcome their evolutionary drive to be the best they possibly can. So even if you believe empathy does this a little bit, you need the largest possible force to stop people doing the worst things. The second response comes from closing government, and they say, well, people wouldn't be mean and rude and angry and cruel, because what if they get punished for it? But the issue with this is they just structurally reason to rule by the strong, because if you're the strongest in community, no one can do anything about it. You can take what you want, you can hurt who you like, which is why you need this currency of validation to regulate violence, to stop people hurting each other, and ensure people care about one another. That means, under their side, societies are brutal, societies don't form, societies are bad. The impact of this is quite clear. We help the sick when they're ill because people care about appearing virtuous. People actually help the old when they can't work anymore. We get one attempt at a response to this, and it is closing government, saying, well, maybe human society is actually bad. First of all, your intuition, as the average person, screams against this with every fiber of your being. You truly believe humans helping each other, feeding each other, and healing each other has been net disutile. Of course you don't. But second of all, on a structural level, times of hunter-gatherers were times of fear, where we hid in the dark from animals that hunted us, where we never had enough food, where we never had enough comfort. Obviously, it is a good thing that societies form. It should be a huge red flag that that is the rebuttal we get to the extension. The result of this is we delete both teams in the opening half as well. Because first of all, against opening government, they say it is bad when you fill people with shame, and this means you feel insecure about yourself. But we first of all explain why the validation mechanisms we talk about are constructed in a good way. That is, you reward people for doing futile things, things that make other people happy, or things that contribute to society. Which means even if you feel shame for not doing it, it is fine that we inflict shame, because we're rewarding people and shaming people for doing things that are socially utile or disutile. It means, second of all, because our benefit here is so large, it doesn't matter that it occasionally misfires. Fine, you might care a little too much about what some people think about you or how you look. That is fine, as long as we get people doing things like contributing to society and holding the social fabric together. We second of all explain that it means there's far less use of force to govern and dictate the needs of people in society. And third of all, it means you don't have any mechanism of God or external morality that hold people to and constrain their behavior. Closing government says, well, God isn't external and it's not about validation, but obviously people care about like the validation of their gods. This is an incredibly important behavior. What this means is that the mechs about shame and feeling bad about how you look are just instantly washed by the sheer gravity of this claim. The poor can eat food, the old can live in houses, and we have a baseline level of safety, respect, and comfort for every human. Opening.
The problem with your claim is that it only happens if there is an external wish to survive. It's unclear where there's no external wish if it isn't pragmatically the right thing, which individuals can prioritize as well. Don't let government wits rebuttal.
All right, so you, first of all, have external validation to survive, but it applies only to yourself, right? Just this guy, which explains why you take food from everyone else, even if it's bad for society, which is why you need external validation and not just internal validation to fulfill that goal. So we form societies, we've deleted this debate, but I'm going to go through the mock and do an extension about people's feelings anyways. We explained to you, and remember, that people feel happier on our side when you have external validation, and that is for the simple reason that sometimes you feel bad about yourself and you can't internally validate, because first of all, you can fall into depressions where you physically can't validate yourself. Second of all, you operate on a hedonic treadmill where the thing you do becomes your norm. And in the absence of people saying that you're doing a good thing, you feel like you're just being normal, which means that even if there are things that would be good for you, such as pursuing a hobby or an education or an art, you drop it because you lose that kind of validation the second it becomes normal to you. It means that, second of all, external validation provides short-term bursts of happiness. You get a smile on your face when someone compliments, I don't know, the skill of your speeches throughout this competition, which means that it's something you should care about because it gives very direct bursts of happiness. This beats opening government because they say people are harsh to one another, but we explain that this is actually better because instead of being harsh to one another, you reward people for good things that they've done. They, second of all, never do the comparative and explain structurally why people want to be kind to themselves. Evolutionarily, your body really wants to survive and is pushing you to do the most you possibly can, which is why you always feel insufficient and you always feel inadequate. At the end of this debate, we ensure humans care for one another and we ensure people feel good about themselves. We so clearly take this debate.